covenant Christian, the one tithe of 10% can be the only true and acceptable explanation. End quote. I will go over each tithe and give my reasons why only one should be used in the new covenant. In this chapter, Dr. Kelly deals with 3 tithes. Yes, there were 3. So the point that Dr. Kelly makes is this: since there were more than one tithe, why doesn't the church teach the same? Now, there's the standard tithe that we've already discussed in chapter 4. The second tithe was for the feast of Israel, in which all partook of and rejoiced together. Here's the second quote. Second, if the church admits that the feast tithe was indeed a second tithe, then it must also teach a minimum of 20% as an expectation of the church. This is a lose-lose situation. End quote. Since the second tithe is to be eaten by all, then why is that not done today? Here's my answer. Most Christians don't celebrate the 7 feasts, except some Messianic Jews, though I feel all Christians should learn about them. After all, most of us don't live in Israel. The attendance of the feasts were mandatory back then, but not today. However, we do have the Lord's Supper, which was instituted before the law of Moses was abolished, which came right out of the Passover and is one of the ordinances for the church today. I'm debating whether I might mention more of the feast tithe in the next chapter. But for now, think of a feast tithe like a big cookout. You might want to consider that most people that even listen to this video do not make their living from farming or having herds of animals. It's the third tithe that gets even trickier. Every third year, a tithe was to be given to the poor. What is not clear is whether the tithe that went to the feast was suspended that year or not. There also is a controversy concerning how each tithe was separated. Well, it is mostly agreed that out of the whole tithe, the priest got exactly 10%. But the other tithe is where the controversy remains. I mean, did the second tithe for the feast come out before or after the first tithe was separated? After 10% was set aside for the priests, was it exactly another 10%, as Dr. Kelly believes, for the feast, or was the following tithe taken from the 90% that was left over? To illustrate, suppose there's 100 bags of wheat. If 10 are set aside for the priest, you would have 90 left over. So consider the second tithe, which you set aside an additional 10 bags, and thus there would be 80 bags left over. Then if there was one additional tithe, meaning that for the poor, be another 10 bags, and so there'd be a total of 70 bags of wheat left over if all 3 tithes were active that year. However, some would say that the first tithe would be 10 bags, which brings us down to 90. But the second tithe, you take 10% of the remaining, and thus you would only take 9 bags out of 90, and that would bring the remainder down to 81. Finally, the last tithe, you would round it, you would take 8 bags and thus bring the total left over be 73 bags. Or is there something else that we're not saying? So that's a little controversy in itself. We cannot know for sure, but if they did take additional tithes from the 90%, then the other tithes would not be as much. That's the point. The question is asked, where are the instructions on the third tithe for the poor? My response is simple. 1, the New Testament is a totally different covenant. As far as the third tithe for the poor, we see in the New Testament it would be done by free will offerings. One particular offering was a year in the making. Today, the poor and welfare in the United States, for example, do not wait 3 years or even a year like the believers in biblical times did, but every month they got a set amount. Yes, it's different today. It goes from 3 years to a matter of months, weeks, or days. While the old covenant, there was a theocracy, it's not that way today. Today we deal with electric bills, heating, oil, gas for the car, insurance, medical, dental, eye care, and a host of other things they simply did not deal with back then. So that is why the tithe is different. And thank God it's not every 3 years before one could get help from the tithe. Here's another quote, "Today there is no valid biblical principle which allows the church to teach only one of 3 types of tithes to support its ministers, and then ignores the national festival tithes and the third-year tithes for the poor and needy. Like the rest of the law, tithing was a complete package with 3 inseparable parts which cannot be divorced from the context of the entire Mosaic law." End quote. Again, remember, the feasts have been fulfilled, and thus that tithe is no longer needed. The poor are taken care of by free will offerings, which I will cover later on in the New Testament. In conclusion, the first tithe was for the support of the Levitical priesthood, while the tithe today is for those who live by the gospel. The second tithe was like a big cookout for the feast of Israel. But today we don't all go to Jerusalem for the feast, but we do have fellowship with other believers by the Lord's Supper and eating a meal together. Finally, the Bible speaks of a special offering to those that are in need. That's how the poor tithe is dealt with today. And you can look up 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 for more details on that. The thing to remember, just as the tithe supported the Levitical priesthood, the ministers of the gospel need our support today. And so if God used that as a means of support in the Old Testament, why not have it for today?